He's from Toronto, Canada, Richard Leblanc. He's an award-winning teacher, researcher, consultant, lawyer, and specialist on boards of directors. He's also an associate professor at York University in Toronto, and he's the author of this book, Inside the Boardroom, How Boards Really Work and the Coming Revolution in Corporate Governance. Richard, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Dennis. Good to be here.
So let's just start with this. What do good board members do?
Board members oversee management in the interests of shareholders. There are tens of thousands of boards of organizations of various shapes and sizes, but at the end of the day, boards oversee the financial statements. They make sure compensation is appropriate. They set the strategy for the organization. They oversee the risks of the organization, and they communicate and are accountable to shareholders.
Well, now, every board member is supposed to do that.
Correct.
And the good ones do it well.
Correct.
Right. Okay. The board, Richard, can't give up this overall responsibility for risk. Is that a fair statement?
Right. And it's overseeing all risks now, not just financial risks, but food safety risk, depending on the business you're in, compliance risk. But what I'm hearing from investors and from boards is that there's too much of an emphasis on risk and compliance since Sarbanes-Oxley and since Dodd-Frank. And what is being underemphasized right now is strategy. And that's in part fault to the regulations because they want independent directors. So what ends up happening is that you bring on directors that are independent of the company, they don't know about the business, they don't know about the industry, and they're now charged with adding value for shareholders and overseeing management that has worked in the industry for 30 or 40 years. So the challenge now for corporate boards is to move away from a compliance mentality, and shareholders are insisting of growth and innovation and competitiveness for the U.S. economy and other economies, and we have uncertainty now with Europe, China, etc. So shareholders want more of their boards and are more demanding of their boards in terms of growth and creation of shareholder value. We had a case in Canada, for example, where CP, a hedge fund in New York, came up to CP. We didn't have one person on the CP board that
CP stands for
Canadian Pacific Rail.
Thank you.
That had rail experience. So there's a tendency to go for the independent directors because that's what the regulators want. And we have accountants, we have lawyers now that are advising on compliance and are advising on risk. And what I'm hearing from boards is that our number one challenge is to add value to management. It's strategy and succession planning.
Okay, good. And Richard, that's a tough balance to put in there, isn't it? How do you, I mean, you've interviewed hundreds of board members for the book you wrote and the books you're working on. Right. And you have listened to what they've said. You've watched the boards actually meet. Give us some idea about what he said there in this regard.
Well, what Bob and I think are saying, and what directors I've interviewed have said, is that we are moving towards a competency matrix. We're looking at what do we need, what are the skill sets we need on the board, industry experience, compensation, risk, and boards now are beginning, they're just beginning in the U.S. to ask themselves what skills do we need and what behaviors do we need. Communication, leadership, integrity. You know, these softer skills are vitally important in a boardroom because you've got, 8, 9, 10 people, 11 people with, large egos. They need to be all work as a team. They need to be well led by an independent chair or an independent lead director. So the softer skills are really important. You can be formally independent. You can have the competencies, but if you don't behave in a certain way and add value and have polished skills, you can take one or two people can take a board off track. It doesn't take much. So now search firms and nominating committees are looking at the softer skills of directors and the hard skills to bring on the best directors.
All the board members were found by
who you know. Who you know.
Yeah. Who you know,
that's right.
The good old boy system, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's happening a little less now, but it's still happening. But Bob is right; it's very hard to put pen to paper, and because you're not good at everything, and you want to say the rub comes in is not only the skills, but who's good at what, and then who might not have the skill set that is needed for the next 2, 3, 5 years. We also have a movement now to bring on women and bring on visible minorities and because the academics have found that they ask the fresh questions and you don't have groupthink. So you have a turnover of boards right now where they're just beginning to look at, who do we have and what do we need, not who do you know. So that's really important. And it's tough to look inward like that and to self-assess yourself because you're a group of a very small group of people.
What actually is working in diversity?
Well, the assumption is that CEOs make the best directors, and the research coming out of Stanford University is that in fact they don't. They are often stretched and they're dominant in terms of their personality type. So we're looking at mixing it up, of renewal, of asking questions, of not being from the sector. Companies are approaching this. Countries are approaching this in different ways. Some countries, there's a 40% quota that could happen in Europe. For women. In Quebec, we had a law 3 years ago that 50% of all boards have to be women, and they have to match the cultural diversity of the community. So it is the #1 issue in corporate governance. The other issue is shareholders want to have a say on who gets on boards. I teach my students that shareholders elect directors. They really don't. Directors self-select themselves. So what's happening now is we have the diversification, a focus on renewal, a focus on skill sets, a focus on shareholder input. Because regulators don't want to have another financial crisis. So they want to ensure that the best people, the best talented people are inside the boardroom in helping management. So we're seeing an uptick now of what should have happened 10 or 20 years ago, but it's just starting now.
So Richard, talk to us about, you said earlier about these soft skills, but talk to us about the behaviors, because if you can have the greatest people, men, women, everything you can, but if the dynamics don't work, it doesn't work either. What makes it work and what keeps it from working inside the room?
Well, what makes it work is attention to communication, listening, persuasiveness, integrity, how you relate to your colleagues, your tone that you use, the words that you use. These things are underemphasized at the cradle grave, and also in terms of the assessment. So I had said to our Securities Commission in Canada, you need to have all your boards across Canada assess peer assessment, individual director self and peer assessment, and all the boards in Canada now do that. The United States is just they actually cited my book, the Securities and Exchange Commission. They're just starting to do this now, where they're saying that boards have to have a self and a peer assessment. Interestingly enough, you don't have a regulatory requirement. Your requirement is to assess committees and boards, but not individual directors. So now you need to look at the skills and qualities of the individual in order to have a collective good dynamic. And if someone, for example, is too controlling or too critical or doesn't prepare for meetings, isn't committed, doesn't have integrity, doesn't match what they say and do, doesn't support board decisions, undermines management, the tone is not there, that defect should be detected and should be either coached or developed or mentored or counseled that person off the board. That is what great boards do. They from time to time, they look at the individual director skill sets and they try to tinker with it. And some people can't change, and some people can't change, and then therefore, or they don't want to change, and therefore they shouldn't be on the board.
It is often the case that it is that person, that man or woman, sitting there, not saying a whole lot, not being out front on every issue, who sometimes is the best thinker if you can just have someone at the chairman level, as an example, or lead director level, who can draw them out. Yes or no?
That's right. You go around the room for the key decisions. You know you're a conductor. You know who, just by reading the body language, by who wants. What you don't want is artificial agreement, and that's where decision failure can happen. So Bob's exactly right. You want to be able to. It's an art. It really is. Chairing a good board is an art, and the most important decision a board makes is not only who's the CEO but also who's the chair. So behavior absolutely matters. The University of Delaware just came out with a study last week that 17% of structural increases are due to peer groups and paying the CEO at 50, 75, or 90. And what's happened is CEO pay to the average worker has gotten so out of whack in the last 10, 15, 20 years. It's 400, 500, 600 times. And there's examples of that where you don't have the performance. So Bob's right. It's the #1 issue. It's not going away. And there's more regulations to come because regulators want to ensure that you have pay for performance and you don't have the incredible wealth disparities that we're having lately.
Are not-for-profit boards just as important that they perform?
They're absolutely just as important because they're often the starting ground for directorships. They deal with children, they deal with students, they deal with beneficiaries. Just because you volunteer doesn't mean they're not important or you don't have risks. So it's a sector that is just crucial, and we may be doing work together, Dennis, on offering a program at your Institute for Not-for-Profit Directors, as I mentioned to Bob earlier. It's a vital sector. It's often the training ground, and they make decisions that affect vulnerable people.
We have 45 seconds left. You have 20 seconds of that, Richard. Go for it.
Is there anything I haven't said that I wanted to say? I guess the number one issues right now are compensation, diversity of boards, separation of chair and CEO in the U.S. is a big issue. This is not going away. This is another 5 or 10 years. We're not where we need to be, but we're making steady progress.